I'm here today with AM of Deathwhite to talk about the upcoming album Gray Everlasting, out June 10th on Season of Mist. How are you doing today?
I'm pretty good, thank you. Thank you for having us.
Well, thank you for taking the time. I'm a big fan of the band. I'm a big fan of the work you guys have been doing. And this album is really Gray Everlasting. Let me tell you, it does have that feeling of walking the fine line between the dark and the light. And you guys found that perfect spot in the middle. Is that where the title comes from?
A little bit. It's sort of a reflection of the times that we live in, too. The album was composed starting in March of 2020, so literally as the pandemic struck. And while we were affected by the pandemic, we were not as impacted as much as other people, and it was not as much of an inconvenience for the band as other bands, but it did not really factor too much into the writing and recording process of it because we record the same way as always. But throughout the writing, that seemed like the general theme that there's this gray cloud hanging over humanity, and it sort of seemed to fit the overall feel and mood of the songs, and made it for a pretty obvious choice for the title. Usually we take a bit to deliberate on what we want to call our albums, but Gray Everlasting, once it was broached by one of us, seemed to be the obvious choice.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. What do you see as the biggest growth for the band sound wise when it comes to this record?
The one thing we wanted to hit upon is that all four of us have extreme metal backgrounds. Each of us have played in, whether it be a thrash, death, black, you name it, type of band. We've all played in different types of metal bands. And those influences always have been lurking a little bit within Deathwhite's sound. We have never quite exploited them until now. So generally, when we sit down and start thinking about a new album, we like to discuss what our goals are. And so for Grave Image, the album that was released 2 years ago, the idea was to get heavier. For Gray Everlasting, the idea was to get a little bit more extreme. So that's probably the biggest step in our development there. Is there are some more extreme metal elements on a few of the songs. In addition, the keyboards play more of a prominent role too. We had used them on our previous efforts, but never quite fleshed them out as much as before. So it was sort of twofold. It was to get a little bit more extreme and then get atmospheric. And I know that sounds a little bit cliche, and I'm sure you hear that a lot from bands that it's always more, more, more. But for us, it was very important that we not write the same album, two albums in a row. We were very happy with what we did on Grave Image, but what we wanted to accomplish on Gray Everlasting was a little bit different than on Grave Image. So it was important that we tried new things. And surely when we find the time to do the next full length album, we will find new things to do as well. But that's always been very important for us as a band, is to evolve and keep on trying new things within the framework of our sound. So hopefully we accomplish that on Gray Everlasting.
The next question is a little bit of a follow-up of what you just said, because I felt with the changes that you guys implemented on this record, it made the album more dynamic than the previous two. The previous two, I felt like the songs, everything stayed more compact, more within a single path. And this album, I felt like you guys had the path, but you're kind of weaving from one extreme of the path to the other extreme. Do you see this album as a more dynamic record from that perspective?
Sure, I think we would all agree with that. And some of that comes with a few of the songs that we did, namely the title track, and there's another song called Blood and Ruin. These are songs that are definitely rely more on atmosphere and different styles of guitar playing than before. They rely more on mood versus the standard distorted guitar songs that we do. And that was done intentionally as well, and sort of to open up the door to try more things like that down the road, to have that type of diversity on our albums. But yeah, the idea was with Gray Everlasting was to have a much more diverse and broad array of songs as before. I think in some respects we have taken some aspects of our sound as far as we can take them, and we've realized it pretty quickly versus running it into the ground. So we're very fortunate we were able to identify those things early on in our career, and that opened the door to doing those type of tracks. And what we really wanted to avoid was having an album of just 10, a collection of 10 songs. We wanted the album to sort of have a journey
Mhm.
to it, if you will, where there are ups and downs and peaks and valleys, if you want to articulate it that way. And that's where those different types of songs come in. So we were very mindful of how the album was sequenced, and we were very mindful too of how certain songs would translate next to one another here, because I don't necessarily know whether people listen to Deathwhite singles. I think, from what we've heard, at least, people listen to our albums in their entirety. So that was very crucial for us to write an album that had various moods and dynamics to it. So yeah, I'm glad you noticed that as well.
You mentioned earlier that when you guys sit down to make a record, you have a little bit of a checklist in terms of what do you want that new album to achieve. From a creative standpoint, where do things start for you guys when it comes time to writing a new album?
We have one or two members in the band that are primary songwriters. We have a primary songwriter. This gentleman usually writes probably 80 to 90% of the material. And the responsibility of this individual is to come up with the foundation of the song. So since we are spread apart in the eastern side of the United States, two of us are in Pittsburgh and the rest are in various states on the eastern coast. We have to work remotely now. So we're not the type of band that gets together in the rehearsal room and hashes out ideas. We are a band that now trades files remotely and works on the songs that way. So in that respect, it is usually one gentleman putting the ideas down, then everyone adds their parts. So, the usually starts with very basic guitars and drums, and then everyone else adds their parts to it. It's like we always compare it to like building a house, one by one, each layer gets built, and almost always the last piece is the vocals. But as has been the case in our career, the vocals are oftentimes the driving force within our band creatively. So if we do not get to a spot where we're happy with the vocals, then a Death White song, more often than not, is not going to work. So the creative process has basically always been the same ever since we started, but now since we're spread out, we have to rely on more modern techniques of file sharing and recording. But it seems to work very well for us. The band works because each of us have our own talents and skills and sort of have free reign to do whatever we like with the songs. And then more often than not, we're very happy with the conclusion of things. We are, however, very particular when it comes to arrangements and riffs and vocal melodies, because we're not really the type of band who sticks in a part just to have a part. And some of that just is because of we have a clean vocalist. And when you have a clean vocalist, you're not really afforded much room in terms of going off the grid necessarily with your parts. Everything has to be, I don't want to say organized because that makes it sound too formal, but we like to have some degree of continuity within our song arrangements here that allow for the clean vocals to come out. So these are always things that we're cognizant of. And especially throughout the writing of Gray Everlasting, we probably even took a even more keen eye to these things, which resulted in a lot of these songs going through a lot of revisions and debate amongst the four of us, but it's always healthy. And we almost always are happy with the result in the end.
You mentioned that the pandemic didn't really impact you guys as much as it did other bands, but was there any other challenges that you guys faced on this record that perhaps were new to this record and not necessarily something that you had faced in the past?
Not necessarily. The only challenge that we have now is that, as mentioned before, is that we are remote. So in the early days of Deathwhite, we were able to get together and prior to heading into the studio and really work hard on the songs and the arrangements and finalizing everything, get everything final, I should say. Now, since we are remote, that probably adds a little bit of time between things, but the four of us are always in contact. We're very close friends. That also factors a lot into how Deathwhite operates. We enjoy each other's company. We enjoy each other's feedback on the song. So that in itself sort of takes away any types of challenges that would present themselves from being a band who is remote and operates in the fashion that we do. But now, but back to your original question, the pandemic didn't really change how we operate. We would have operated this way regardless of the pandemic or not. It's just that the pandemic, unfortunately, like everyone else in the world, made us a little bit more isolated than normal. But after a while, you learn to uh, come to grips with the situation and make the best out of it, which hopefully we did. But by no means did we have a rough time during the pandemic. That we were very fortunate in relation to other people.
The sound of the guitars, I need to touch on that because I felt listening to this album, the guitars had a little bit more fuzz on the sound, which I really, it brought like this, I don't know, this caveman doom feel to some of the tracks. I think it was there before, but perhaps not as predominant, or at least not as noticeable as it is on this record. How do you view that guitar sound? Do you see that same aspect as I did listening to the album?
The guitar tone is different. You are correct, Pedro. From the from Grave Image, we used a different amp setup and different reamping setup this time as well. It's probably a little bit more doomy, and this is an ongoing debate within the band because not everyone within Deathwhite likes doom. We actually have a few guys who aren't into doom, believe it or not. So while we are a classified sometimes as a doom metal band, whether that's right or wrong, that's not up for us to make that distinction. There is at least half the band who actually do not enjoy doom metal, and there are some styles of doom metal that a few of us truly dislike to the point that they find it unlistenable. But that does not factor into the guitar sound. The guitar sound was driven by the fact that some of these songs are heavier and more extreme, and there's probably a little bit more tremolo picking and types of harmonies throughout the album that made it give it a little bit more weight than before. And that also applies to the drums too. The because the drums are probably a little bit more busy this time out, there's a little bit of a different sound on it as well. But that goes back to what we were saying earlier. You never want to have the same type of songs album to album. You never want to have the same type of sounds from album to album. That is, unless you are AC/DC and can continue to write the same album over and over again. And usually that works for them, but by no means are we in the same ballpark as they are. But yeah, it's always important to try new things and get new sounds out of it. And we're very lucky to work with a gentleman named Shane Mayer, who is an absolute expert in engineering and whom we are also very close with as well, who understands our sound and is willing to work with us on getting things to a point where we're happy with. And more often than not, we spend half a day thinking about the guitar sound, and then we're usually ready to go with it. So we're very happy with it.
It's really interesting that you're saying this because when I was listening to the album, I could tell the differences from this record to the previous record, talking about the two that are close together. But at the same time, it was still Death White all the way through. It's just
Mhm.
it was just another step that you guys took. You opened a different door on that hallway that you've been walking on, and it's still the band's DNA is still there. It's just slightly different presentation. Let's put it that way. And that's, I think,
Oh,
one of the
sure.
beauties of the record.
Sure, there definitely is a lot of continuity between Grave Image and Gray Everlasting, and a lot of that boils down to is that when we sat down to write the songs, some of them came pretty quickly after the release of Grave Image, so we were still sort of in that mode after Grave Image, but certain life events got in the way halfway through the making of Gray Everlasting that maybe it allowed us to take a step back and think about trying some different things with the songs. But you are correct in that assertion that our core sound has remained intact, and we don't really want to veer too much off of that. We have a singer whose voice is fairly identifiable, who is central to our sound. Our drummer plays a certain way, and us as guitarists, we play a certain way too, and we write a certain style of riffs that may be identifiable to Deathwhite. But by no means does that make us a unique band by any stretch. But these are elements that are intrinsic to our sound. So there's certainly a common thread between the two albums that we want to keep, and that's probably something likely we will continue to do going forward. It would probably be out of character for us to make a drastic change in sound. It probably more something where we'd like to evolve. But in thinking about the bands who have primarily influenced us, the two bands that we always go back to is Catatonia and Paradise Lost, neither of whom sound like they do when they got their start.
Mhm.
So they have morphed and changed dramatically over the years while still writing great songs. So that's something that is intriguing to us quite a bit. But we're only 3 albums into our career. We certainly have a long way to go, and we're trying to get better as songwriters. That's first and foremost. Songwriting to us is a fine art that very few have come to master, And that's probably why we are so ingrained in the process and take such a fine tooth comb to everything, is that we're still developing as songwriters and hope to reach a certain point where we can truly go off into some new adventurous things down the road.
You touched on something that I thought was really interesting when it came to the vocals and how the vocals then interact with the songs that you're creating. And if things don't work out, then that song gets thrown out. I feel like
Correct.
the vocals are such an important part of the experience of listening to Deathwhite. It's just, it gives you goosebumps when you're listening to some of these tracks in terms of how deep it cuts with the lyrical content tied into to how the vocals sound, to the atmosphere, to like everything together. Does it blow your mind sometimes when you're looking at the finished product and you're listening to those vocals on that finished sound, how everything came together almost effortlessly? It seems to us listening to it.
We're very fortunate to have a vocalist who has a broad range of styles and can sing basically anything asked of him. But to his credit, he has tons of ideas on the vocal front. And Grave Everlasting, more than our previous efforts, was really his opportunity to try harmonies and different styles of vocals as heard throughout. So hearing the songs in their embryonic stage, and then when this gentleman gets to demo them, by the time he is done with his demos, they're almost fully realized songs to begin with. He's gotten that good at demoing on his own and writing vocal lines and melodies. There's usually a guide vocal for him to start with that some of us create for him, but in terms of the finished product for the vocals, our vocalist almost always takes center stage with that regard and almost always blows us away. I think we all share the same sentiment as you do, Pedro, when we hear the final result with the vocals. And vocals in Deathwhite are, excuse me, the central element to what we do. We've sort of made it a point and have been very, no pun intended here, very vocal about how important clean vocals are to our sound. And without delivering them properly, we really don't have much to work with in Deathwhite. So there's a lot of care and pride taken into how we write our lyrics and our vocal melodies. So when it gets to the finished product and everything is mixed and mastered, and then you hear everything come together, it's a tremendous moment. And that's what we do the band for. We certainly don't do it to achieve any sort of monetary gain or fame and fortune, or otherwise be playing a much different style of music. That's the reward in the end, is writing these songs and collaborating with one another, and then hearing the finished product much like you do, and then feeling very proud of what we accomplished with. There's really no other feeling that can compare to that.
You touched on the lyrical content. Where does that lyrical content come from? How's the inspiration for it get going?
We used to be very much an inward facing band, but for the last two albums we're very much outward now. So we have sort of taken a observation stance of the world and what's going on. And clearly, I don't think we need to delve into too much as to what's happening in the world right now, but it makes for very easy lyrical fodder, unfortunately. Granted, we would much prefer it to be the other way. We would much rather have a difficult time finding negative things to say about the world that it is. But being that the things in this environment aren't going the way they should be, and humanity continues to take steps backwards when we should be going forwards, and we can't resolve our differences like adults anymore, and we can't take care of the planet like we should for future generations, and we can't agree on basic principles and fundamentals of truth and honor and dignity, then that just gives us, it's like shooting ducks in a barrel basically for us, shooting fish in a barrel, I should say, for writing lyrics. So the scope of Gray Everlasting really is about the world and its various perils here. I mean, it's much like we did on Grave Image. Some songs are a bit more topical. We have a song called No Thought or Memory, which is about the opioid epidemic here in the United States. There's another song called White Sleep, which is really about the pandemic and some of the strife that we were experiencing here in the United States, and going to sleep and just frankly not wanting to wake up, or sleeping long enough to where you wake up and then it's all over, but knowing that, it's not really going to be over. So those things take sort of a very sharp and drastic turn on the lyrical front, but the world makes it easy for us to write those kind of lyrics. So that's what Gray Everlasting is about. Somewhere buried within there, if you listen very closely, there is a very minor glimmer of hope in there in a few of the songs, and I think that's sort of for our own self-preservation in the end. We don't want to go full doom and gloom on everybody, although we have often debated doing so, and that may arise on future albums if mankind stays on this trajectory or going backwards, if you want to put it that way.
When it comes to this band and to the four of you, are you for perfectionists?
Half of us are perfectionists, probably the other half or not. The one half of the band operates on feel and how it feels in the heart. Then two of us, and we have a gentleman in the band who's a professional musician who tours frequently, and then probably count our vocalist in that too as someone who would count as perfectionist. But generally, when you are as skilled as these individuals are on their respective instruments and are capable of such great things, perfection is often what they seek and often what they can achieve. And achieving anything less than that is unacceptable to them. But we also have members in the band who rely sort of on their gut emotion on how something feels. So it's a very nice contrast that we have and Deathwhite. And to that point, we have a nice blend of personalities here. No one individual of Deathwhite is the same. We are a very nice mix of individuals who are all different and have different ways of going about doing things, but we all share the common goal of wanting what's the best for Deathwhite. So in that in that regard, everything usually comes together pretty nicely in the end between balancing between perfection and feel.
I have one last question for you. When it comes to making a Deathwhite record, not necessarily this one, but a Deathwhite record in general, how would you define that process? Draining, exhausting, rewarding, all the above?
Uh, it's primarily rewarding. You'd hate to say that it's draining because we do it for fun, and if we didn't do it for fun, we wouldn't do it. And once the band stops being fun, we would stop doing it immediately. But the band is something that each of us hold in very high regard, and it's something because we are a studio band. We've only played once. We only played live once, and that was 4 years ago. And we may play live again. The band is something that is very fun for us, so the experience is almost always rewarding from start to finish. Just demoing songs at home between the four of us to getting together to track the albums, doing photo shoots, and being with one another. That's the ultimate reward being in Deathwhite. And then the icing on the cake is when someone says something nice about what you've created. And when we receive positive messages from fans who have enjoyed our work and recognize what we do, that certainly feels great and something we take tremendous amount of pride in. And that's partly what keeps us going. But really, the whole experience is very rewarding. All of our albums have been very rewarding. Sure, there are bumps in the road, but there are likely no bands out there that do not experience bumps in the road while recording. But the four of us are adults who very much enjoy each other's company and time. We've been friends for a very long time. And that in itself is what makes Deathwhite very special to the four of us. And when we consider ourselves very fortunate to have this opportunity to write songs and release them and have people like yourself interested in talking to us. It's something we don't take for granted and are very grateful for.
Well, I'm grateful that you guys are making this music because every album is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, you
Well,
guys
thank
are
you.
on an incredible path of glory, I must say. Like the moment I get an email about an album release from you guys, that jumps the queue above everybody else because
Oh,
I'm
that's
always
great to
so
hear.
interested to see what do you have in store for me? What journey are you going to take me on? And Gray Everlasting was just a phenomenal album to experience. I think the first time I listened to it, I probably played it 6 times in a row.
Hmm.
I was on a flight, so it was a 6-hour flight, so I listened to it at least 6 times
Oh,
uh,
that's great.
in a loop. And that tells you
Yeah,
something that it just doesn't get old. It feels fresh every single time you play it.
that's great. Well, we very much appreciate the kind words, Pedro.
Thank you very much for your time today. All the best to you
Yeah,
and the guys, and all the best with the release on June 10th on
yeah.
Season Mist.
Thank you so much. All the
Thank you.
best.